Hi, I'm Laura Flanders, and this is CityWorks, a production of the City University of New York School of Labor and Urban Studies and CUNY TV. Every month, CityWorks examines an aspect of the lives of working people on the job and at home, in New York and in the greater urban landscape. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought into focus our reliance on e-commerce and the delivery of goods. Have you ever stopped to wonder what are the steps taken from harvest or the factory floor to your doorstep? Who labors and for whose benefit? We have a very interesting guest coming up today. Christopher Mims writes about technology in the age of e-commerce for the Wall Street Journal. First up, though, on today's program, video clips featuring two outstanding scholars speaking at a School of Labor and Urban Studies forum called Challenging Monopoly: Antitrust Reforms, Worker Rights, and Economic Democracy. The forum drew on the expertise of Zephyr Teachout, Fordham Law School professor and antitrust scholar, and SLU professor Samir Sonti. Among many insights, Teachout and Sonti examine the question, can we recover our freedom? Check it out.
We are at a new moment where there is growing anti-monopoly fervor that is actual, popular on the ground. And it's one of those things where I think the public is ahead of the elected officials, where you see, like, if you talk to the Spectrum strikers, who are in one of the longest strikes in New York City history, right downtown New York City, they get it that after the merger went through, they just didn't have negotiating power anymore. Up until then, it's not like they love talking to Charter. It's just that they at least got a seat at the table. And once there is one or two or three, you don't need just one, two or three employers, they aren't even listening anymore. So we are seeing this revival of worker-led anti-monopolism, small business-led anti-monopolism. It's going to be really hard, but it's pretty exciting to see.
There's a famous old book by this historian Ellis Hawley called "The New Deal and the Problem of Monopoly," where he wrestles with this kind of central tension within the New Deal coalition between, and this is a crude kind of simplistic summary of it, but between trust busting, breaking up companies, and planning, regulating, and public ownership, and so on. And this is a debate that progressives have had for a long time, right? Should we be breaking up companies, or should we be trying to regulate them and use the size for good, or perhaps nationalize them depending on what sector they're in, so on? And well, I'm going to pose it to you because you have I think a nuanced take on this. And so what is, in spite the title is "Break Them Up," which suggests something, but I think your take is actually maybe a bit more more nuanced than the title suggests. So what's your thought on this age-old progressive debate about what to do about bigness?
When I say break them up, I mean what you might think of as classic trust busting, which is like break up Facebook from Instagram. But I also mean a core way to break up corporate tyranny is ending forced arbitration, because that is a system of private courts. A core way to break up corporate tyranny is changing the way we fund campaigns, because sort of a key mechanism of power is money politics, and post Citizens United, but pre-Citizens United too. Oh, sorry. So that's a segue. My first title for this book was "Who's Going to Make the Shoes?" Because I was sort of getting so frustrated talking to progressives about, like, okay, I get the problems, but like, I want to hear a vision of your economy. And I have one. I have a vision of the economy, and the vision of the economy involves unionized workforces in the private sector, involves more co-op structures. And by the way, that's not a personal choice matter. That's a policy choice. We don't have policies that enable meaningful co-ops right now, and that kind of coordination. And in some industries involves nationalization of the industry. I strongly support Medicare for all. I really resist the framing, and I know you, even the way you asked it, you showed that you're a little resistant. The framing of this as a choice. The question is not, should everything in society be made by the government? or should everything in society be privately made? It is what things in society should we publicly provide, like education, which I believe strongly in, and what things should we privately provide. The one area that I think is not okay is where there has been a little bit of a more of a consensus, which is oligopolist private governance in coordination with the state. And that is, that's the vision of like 2 or 3 big companies that are regulated by the state. I think that's actually the most dangerous of these because of the conflict, the sort of core conflict of interest that these companies have profit incentives. And so I think when it comes to, any given industry, we say, okay, so what are our goals for this industry? What is the way that we can best provide it? And in healthcare, for instance, I think we need Medicare for all, and we need to be doing some serious anti-monopoly work in the pharma area, and we need to be doing some serious anti-monopoly work in something that is even easier to understand, like medical devices. One of the reasons our prices are so high is that we have allowed for radical concentration in prosthetics. One of the reasons the prices are so high is that we've allowed for massive hospital consolidation. And that's true if they're nonprofit too, by the way. Prices are higher, nurses get paid less when you have hospital consolidation. So this either or is really problematic. And I'll just use one example. We have a very nationalized industry. It's the Department of Defense, right? You don't get more nationalized than that. But because we have allowed for contractors to move from 65 to under 5 in the last 40 years, those 5 contractors are then dictating federal policy instead of federal policy dictating those contractors. When there is a problem of concentrated power, you take on the root of the power, and there is nothing more central. It's like, why are we avoiding the power problem? Like, yes, don't just protest Pfizer after we've allowed it to gobble up all these other companies. Protest it now. Don't protest Caremark and CVS after they've gobbled everything up, and say, change your policies. We have to talk about the illegitimacy of this form of government.
Your former, or a co-author of yours, Lena Khan, who you mentioned, is the head of the FTC. Another associate of yours, Tim Wu, is the head of the antitrust division of the Department of Justice. The Biden administration is clearly put people in high places on questions that you care about that seem to think similar to you. So what's your take? How's the Biden administration doing on the question of anti-monopoly and antitrust?
It's pretty amazing. I feel like I don't want to declare premature victory, but we're pretty close to winning the war of ideas. And now we have the hard part, which is, really fighting against the entrenched power that don't want the change to happen. But Biden gave a speech, really profound speech this summer, where he said to me, failed. He said the policies of the last 40 years, and I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not paraphrasing the word failed. He said failed. It wasn't like what we're used to hearing from Democratic or Republican presidents. Frankly, since 76, since I was 5. There's more like tweaking. He said, this isn't working. And when we're thinking about Striketober and the number of workers who are going up against corporate monopolies, whether it's John Deere or American Airlines, where we have failed these workers by allowing these mergers. Like when the FTC allowed these mergers, it wasn't just like, yes, airlines are non-responsive to your complaints, which you actually know they are. It was, we were failing the workers because we were actually putting them in conditions where they had no power to negotiate. And his speech was powerful because he used the word failure and because he centered it in workers. He centered it in the research that shows that there are thousands of dollars a year that have effectively been stolen from workers by our monopoly choices that concentrated in concentrated industries, you can track $5,000 to $15,000 a year that workers would have gotten if the industries weren't as concentrated. This is on us, and we've got a lot of work to do. It's bringing in Lena, bringing in Tim Wu, really powerful moments. But now this is why we need the movement, because you need an inside-outside game. And what you're seeing now is like the Teamsters and others really leaning into anti-monopoly work. Like if we're going to protect delivery drivers, we can't just let Amazon run rampant. So when I started talking about this, it was like, even in 2014, I frankly got interested in this before that, but started really talking about it publicly in 2014. It just sort of sounded like this niche technical issue. And I give Biden a lot of credit for making it front and center, but we got a lot of work to do.
And we're joined now by Christopher Mims, technology writer for the Wall Street Journal. His new book, Arriving Today, From Factory Floor to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and What We Buy, is just out. Critics have called it a, quote, enlightening exploration of e-commerce, combining studies of human ingenuity, technological advances, and labor practices. Mr. Mims explores the history of a labor system that prizes efficiency above all else, including the design of an Amazon warehouse. The book is also packed with stories about workers. And if there was really any takeaway, I think, from it, it's that workers do have a future. Yep, the human sort. So with that cheery note, I turn to Christopher. Welcome to the show. Glad to have you, Chris. Your timing on this book, Arriving Today, was perfect in many ways. You find yourself in Vietnam to start a journey of tracking the trajectory of a USB charger to the doorstep of its consumer, as it were, its purchaser, right as the COVID pandemic is about to hit. Talk a little bit about what you saw in that moment and the sort of predictions that you made then, and to the degree to which they became true.
Yeah, completely by accident. I was in Vietnam as the World Health Organization was announcing, that there was a new pandemic that was breaking out in Wuhan, China. And so when I was sitting in this terminal, in this port, watching containers full of goods that would, soon be panic bought in the United States were being loaded onto these ships, everything was business as usual. So at the beginning of, this crisis for the world and for global supply chains, it was like any other day. People were loading these containers onto ships, which were then going to slow steam and take a couple of weeks to get to the US before all those goods were going to be unloaded. And it was really only as I followed them back to the US that the crisis kind of broke on our shores. And then my reporting, it took on a totally different tenor, because everybody who I was with, whether they were a warehouse worker or a truck driver, was operating under extraordinary circumstances in an emergency situation where they were a form of frontline workers, but one that was invisible to a lot of people.
Now, they were also operating under a set of false assumptions, a point that you make out. A lot of the businesses involved in global trade had anticipated a similar thing would play out as followed the 2008 financial crisis, namely a recession, people buying less, having less purchasing power. But in fact, the opposite took place and put exactly this global supply chain that you're reporting on under tremendous strain. What's your biggest takeaway from that, apart from that big people can be wrong?
Yeah, two things. When you look at all the ships stacking up at the port of LA, Long Beach, and all the problems we have in trucking and the empty shelves and all the rest, it's a demand problem as much as it is a supply problem, right? People are spending more on more goods than ever still. Since May 2020, Americans really went on a shopping spree. And, secondly, this has exposed all of these weak links in global supply chains, whether it's the unsustainability of our current model of how we employ long haul truckers, or the demands that, automated warehouses place on workers to kind of work ever faster and oftentimes beyond their capacity, their physical capacity, to, what's happening in ports where in some ways, it's a decade of underinvestment. And there's just insufficient capacity, and it cannot be scaled up at a rate that we would need in order to address the unprecedented demand that we're experiencing in our economy right now.
Yeah, this purchasing happening because people were consuming fewer services. So instead they bought more stuff, partly because they needed it at home, not in some other venue, but also because they had time on their hand and need to entertain children. Let me ask you, Chris, you've mentioned a bunch of different workers there, and I want to go through some of them, but we don't have a whole lot of time. But it's very interesting in your discussion of the longshore workers, those people who offload these containers. You talk about automation and what it has and hasn't done to those unionized workers in particular.
Yeah, so ports are a choke point in the global supply chain. There's an incredibly strong union at the Port of Los Angeles in particular, and so they renegotiate contracts periodically. They have a lot of say over the conditions of their work, and so the last time there was a round of automation at a couple of terminals there, they were able to negotiate that they really wouldn't lose jobs, but they would switch roles from being the humans who were driving the trucks that were moving containers around in these ports to being the humans who are maintaining the robots who would do that. They're about to enter another negotiation, and I think they're hoping to accomplish the same thing again. It does seem clear that automation in these ports does make them more efficient. It's not clear that it eliminates jobs because you end up needing so many people to maintain these machines. So you get more throughput, but you need more of a different kind of person. So if people are going to keep their jobs, then they have to be retrained to be mechanics and the like.
And what are the lessons there for unions, the longshore workers union in particular?
Well, I think paradoxically, one of the lessons is that when you increase automation in a system, workers can have more leverage because, if worker A who's working with no automation is only producing 10 widgets a day and worker B who's working with automation is producing 1,000 widgets a day, if worker B calls out sick, that system has a much bigger problem. There's just less flexibility there. So, workers in whether they are truckers or warehouse workers, when they work in the context of automation, and especially now when we have kind of a labor shortage across the US, it's clear that these workers have more leverage. I do think, though, that our laws have made it progressively over the past decades more difficult for workers to unionize. So even though workers have more leverage, and that's translating into higher wages, as we saw with Amazon in Alabama, it's still really hard for workers to actually organize into actual unions.
Talk about your time with the long-haul truckers.
Long-haul trucking is a particularly challenging industry in the United States. The average long-haul truckers on the road 21 days per month. They're not sleeping at home. They've got 14-hour days. And if they're new to the industry, they're only making about $45,000 a year. There's a shortage of places for them to sleep. There aren't enough rest stops. And, overall, the average age of truckers keeps rising because they have a burnout and retention problem, especially among younger truckers. It's just a very difficult life, and they're paid by the mile. And, for a lot of folks who get into the industry, they find it's just not worth it for them. So a lot of people churn through that industry very quickly.
Yeah, then they wonder why they can't attract women. I heard somebody from that industry saying the other day, we really should change to allow people to be home every few days. I thought, yeah, that might help things a little.
Yeah.
The other incredibly stressed group of workers that you spent time with, although some of them seemed to be quite happy, were those famous Amazon warehouse workers. What I learned from your book is that Amazon warehouses are very different each from each other. There's a huge spectrum. So it really, I'm assuming, would depend on who you spoke to, what the exact conditions of their lives and work is. But can you just generalize about what you call Bezosism? And is it just a kind of 21st century version of Taylorism, what we associate with the Ford auto factories and so on?
Yeah, Bezosism is my name for, the kind of modern day speeding up of work. It was invented by Frederick Taylor, who invented scientific management, and also Henry Ford at the same time, to regulate his workers on the assembly line at his automobile factories. And, Bezosism is those systems of, analyzing every step of a task that's repeated over and over again in order to make people more efficient, plus, a lot more surveillance, a lot more technology, and really management by algorithm. So if you work in an Amazon fulfillment center, which is their warehouses that they're sending, your order out from, your boss truly is an algorithm. So there's a software system that's monitoring how long it takes you to do every task, how long your breaks are, how long you spend what they call time off task, not doing your job. And you're reprimanded by that software if you can't keep up. Of course, then a human manager will come and talk to you, but it's kind of this good cop bad cop dynamic where the algorithm is the bad cop and the human gets to come in and kind of be more humane. But it doesn't change the fact that ultimately the manager is the algorithm in these contexts.
And it's all about making rate.
Yes, it's all about meeting a particular floating rate of, picks per hour. That's picks off of a shelf into a bin, or stows where you're taking items out of bins and putting them onto these robotic shelves, or, packing them into boxes. I mean, those are the three main tasks at these warehouses. So, Amazon has told me that that's a floating rate, that it's an average of what everyone in that warehouse can accomplish, and, therefore it's humane. But I've heard from individual workers that the way that the system really works is it's designed to weed out, the slower workers. And because it's a floating rate, it doesn't really allow for people having a bad day or people being sick that day. And I think Amazon has gotten away with this for a long time because they were paying higher than standard industry wages. And so they had a lot of turnover. And so they could just churn through workers. Now I think they're having a problem with they're so big that they're running out of workers to churn through. So they're having to, probably change the conditions of work in some ways.
Well, we've found out that workers often eventually organize in response to being churned through. Do you think there is potential for organizing at Amazon that would be successful? And if so, would the union necessarily be different in form than the kind of industrial unions we saw years ago?
It's a great question. Walmart workers have never organized in significant numbers. The other industries that have similar turnover to what you see in Amazon warehouse workers, like fast food, call centers, have had limited or very little organizing. So I don't know the answer to that question. It's difficult to ascertain whether Amazon with, just pay and benefits and anti-union action can sort of keep ahead of that forever. And again, our laws have changed to make it more difficult to establish a union in a workplace. And I think that can't be discounted.
Well, one place there are still unions, or there is still a union, is at UPS, the delivery service. And you end your book, I have to say rather charmingly, with the folks that you call, or somebody has called, the industrial athletes of our economy, namely delivery people. Talk about ending the book there. It was the end of your journey of your USB charger, but it felt more significant than that to me as I read it.
Yeah, I mean, for me as a reporter, I think part of the significance of that was seeing that there are different styles of management, even when, management and workers together are trying to be as efficient as possible. I mean, obviously, the average UPS delivery person is a massively efficient industrial athlete, as they are called. Of course, they get there through training, and because UPS is invested in its workers, because they have a strong union, there is a different kind of relationship there where those jobs are coveted, they're highly paid. There's, if not a lifelong relationship, often a multi-year relationship where it's in everybody's interest to keep those workers healthy. It's very different from a model where you push workers as hard as you can, and if they get injured or they burn out, you just replace them with the next person who's in line for that job, which is, of course, that's how Amazon's delivery network works, because it's not unionized, because it's newer. FedEx has a similar model. But, all those delivery people who come to your door who aren't UPS, they're not directly employed by the companies whose uniforms they're wearing. I mean, it doesn't matter that somebody showed up on an Amazon van. Technically, they're not an employee of Amazon. Well,
at the end of the day, I wondered about your subtitle, because you do, as you've just said, sort of end the book talking about how important people are. This industrial athlete who goes up and down out of that truck, knows where the packages are, is figuring out how to deal with the dogs in her neighborhood, and so on and so forth. So with respect to everything having changed about how and what we buy, has it?
I think that it has changed in that, the systems of management and the automation that has been added to them have sped things up, have accelerated our adoption of e-commerce, have replaced a lot of physical retail. And frankly, I think that change is just beginning. I mean, I think that the shift toward just ordering everything for delivery tomorrow is only accelerating. It will employ just as many people, if not more people, than the old physical retail system, but they're going to be doing very different jobs. So I think the conversation we need to be having is not, are robots and automation replacing humans? Because they're not. But how are they changing the jobs that millions of people do?
So just as the much maligned Luddites, in fact, didn't want to destroy the machines, just have human control over them, that should still remain organized labor's goal.
Yes, I think for the foreseeable future, if history has any lesson to teach us, it's that.
All right. Christopher Mims, thank you so much. It's a great book. I really recommend it. Arriving Today, From Factory to Front Door, Why Everything Has Changed About How and What We Buy. Christopher writes for the Wall Street Journal about technology. Thank you for joining us at CityWorks.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
That's it for CityWorks. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for the show, write to us. That's cityworks@slu.cuny.edu. For CityWorks, thanks for joining us. I'm Laura Flanders.